This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Outlaws of Thunder Junction set review. So far I've looked at all the non-mono green cards in this set, and today we're looking at those green ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with the letter grade. If you're new to my set review and unsure what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in play boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play boosters in this set have a couple of different bonus sheets, not to mention special guests, and I'll cover those cards after we finish looking at the whole set. In fact, that's what we'll be doing in the next video. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them. The goal here is to have this set review ready for you for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some stuff, but as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the green cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. First up, it's Aloe Alchemist, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon plant warlock. It's a 3/2 with trample. And when it becomes plotted, target creature gets +3/+2 and gains trample until end of turn, and you can plot it for 1 generic and a green. That means you can pay that cost and exile it from your hand, cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost, plot only as a sorcery. This feels pretty good. One of the bummers about plotting a creature is that you do it and don't get anything right away when you do, but Aloe Alchemist says to heck with that. I'm going to give a huge stats boost that makes pretty much any creature into a threat when you plot me. In the end, you get +3/+2 and trample and a 3/2 with trample for only 2 mana. Sure, it's spread out across 2 turns and not quite as insane as if this did it on ETB, but the value is pretty ridiculous, and you can always just run this out on turn 2 if you need to, giving it a B. Next up, it's Anklebiter, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 snake at common with Death Touch. 1 mana 1/1 Death Touchers are always a C. They aren't insane, but the ability to trade your 1-drop for anything is pretty nice. Works well with fight and bite effects too, giving it a C. Next up, it's Beast Bond Outcaster, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 human druid at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card, and you can plot it for 1 generic and a green. You can play this on 3 if you're just trying to curve out, and then the times when you get to draw from the ETB feel amazing. Plot here can be useful if you don't have something else to do on 2, or if you know you have a 4-power creature coming later, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Betrayal at the Vault, which for 4 generic and 2 green is an uncommon instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each of 2 other target creatures. 6 mana is a lot, but this is an instant and it can generate 2-for-1s, so getting back 6 mana worth of value is very doable. You have to be a little careful with it, as usual with green removal, otherwise you won't get the full value back. Like if your opponent kills a creature you target with this, you basically lose because you get 2-for-1 and lose a ton of tempo. I do think that's a problem, and it probably prevents us from getting like a premium level grade. I'm giving it a C+. You also probably don't want more than 1. Next up, it's Bristleback Sentry, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/3 plant wolf at common. It's got Defender. As long as you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it can attack as though it didn't have Defender. We saw an almost identical creature back in Ixalan, original Ixalan, and it performs super well. This is better than some versions of this card we've seen before since it counts itself. In other words, if you can get its power to 4, it can attack all on its own, and that's a pretty big deal. It's not a disaster even when you can't get it going as a 3/3 that can block and trade early, but it looks like it'll be easy enough to attack within this format that I'm pretty high on this 2-drop, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bristly Bill's Spine Sower. For 1 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 legendary plant druid at Mythic Rare. It has landfall, so when a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 green to double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. This is really good. Ideally, you wait to play him until you can also drop a land afterwards. That way you get that +1/+1 counter before your opponent has a chance to take him down. Then if Bill sticks around, the counters are going to go wild, and in the late game, his activated ability is pretty relevant too. +1/+1 counters aren't a huge theme in this set, but obviously he makes them, and there are enough others around that his ability will be nice enough. This is an insane 2-drop that will take over the game if you play it early, and if you play it late, it's no slouch either. I think it sneaks into the lower bomb range, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Tarantula, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 plant spider at common. It costs 1 generic less to cast if you control a desert, it has reach, and when it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. Even without the desert upside, this wouldn't be terrible in green decks. Tarantula basically can't be dealt with outside of combat without you coming out ahead, so the fact that this will cost 5 a decent chunk of the time makes it a solid card, giving it a C. Next up, it's Colossal Rattleworm, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 worm at rare. It has Flash if you control a desert, it has Trample, and you can pay 1 generic and a green and exile it from your graveyard to search your library for a desert, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Without a desert, you get a super efficient 4-drop that can even fix your mana from the graveyard. If you have a desert, Colossal Rattleworm will feel like a straight-up bomb because flashing in a creature this big and cheap really lets you wreck an opponent's attack in a big way, then you untap with a massive creature and probably turn it sideways. You won't always be able to give it flash, but the baseline is really good and the ceiling is insane. I'm willing to give this an A-. Next up, it's Dance of the Tumbleweeds, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It has Spree. That means you can choose 1 or more additional costs, so you can pay 1 generic to search up a desert or a basic land card and put it on the battlefield. And you can pay 3 generic to create an XX green elemental creature token where X is the number of lands you control. This looks pretty good to me. Sure, its baseline is a ramp spell that doesn't add to the board, but it does get the land untapped, which matters. And then in the late game, if you sink 6 into this, you're getting a land and a huge body. That makes it a great late game top deck, unlike spells that purely search up lands, while still having that early game utility. I'm giving it a C+. And if this format's slow enough, it could be even better. Next up, it's Drover Grizzly, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 bear mount at common. When it attacks while saddled, creatures you control gain trample until end of turn. It has Saddle 1. That means you can tap any number of other creatures you control with total power 1 or more, and this mount becomes saddled until end of turn, saddle only as a sorcery. 3 mana 4/2s are fine, especially in a set where one of the green color pairs is into 4 or more power. Mix in the mount upside, and I think we've got a solid card here. Even just giving it self-trample is sure to change things a bit for your opponent, giving it a C. Next up, it's Free Strider Commando, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 common centaur mercenary. When it enters the battlefield, it does so with 2 +1/+1 counters on it if it wasn't cast or no mana was spent to cast it, and it has plot for 3 generic and a green. A 3 mana 3/3 is kind of passable, and this does have upside, though it is a little awkward. You have to pay more mana if you want to plot it, and if you go that route, it will be a 5/5, but paying 4 mana for a 5/5 you get a turn later isn't that amazing. It is nice that if you reanimate it or otherwise put it into play without casting it, it also gets those counters, but the whole package here is probably just a C. Next up, it's Free Strider Lookout, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 human rogue at rare. It's got reach. Whenever you commit a crime, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This ability triggers only once each turn. This is a solid creature as a baseline, and getting even 1 land out of it will feel pretty good. In the early game, the ramp can really matter too, giving it a B. Next up, it's Full Steam Ahead, which for 3 generic and 2 green is an uncommon sorcery. Until end of turn, each creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample, and this creature can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. This overrun effect seems serviceable. +2/+2 and trample is enough to make mini boards lethal, and making it so each of your creatures can only be single blocked really matters, as it means more trample damage will get through. It also means that even if you can't do lethal, your opponent is likely to have to settle for some ugly blocks to not die. Still, it's highly situational. If your board isn't developed, this is pretty bad, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Giant Beaver, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/4 beaver mount at common with vigilance. When it attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature that saddled it this turn, and it has Saddle 3. This looks nice. A 4 mana 4/4 with vigilance is already in the C+ range, and this can buff your other creatures, so this is super efficient for what it is, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Gold Rush, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. Create a treasure token. Until end of turn, up to 1 target creature gets +2/+2 for each treasure you control. At worst, this is 2 mana for +2/+2 and a treasure. That's not amazing, but it isn't bad either, and sometimes you'll get an even more efficient boost, giving it a C. Next up, it's Gold Vein Hydra, which for X and a green is a mythic rare Hydra. It's a 0/0 with vigilance, trample, and haste, and it enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, you create a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to its power. Most of the time, a creature that costs X and 1 colored mana can never really be efficient, But you can fix that by slapping 3 keywords on the creature, like in this case. You can play this out on turn 4 and feel fine about it, and then in the later game it continues to scale and can be absolutely massive. The treasure angle is interesting because it means running this out even earlier isn't the worst idea, because even if you have to play it as a 3-mana 2/2, you can trade it off and get some nice mana. The treasure means less in the late game, of course, but the big body in the late game will be much more relevant. I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Hard Bristle Bandit, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 plant rogue at common. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Whenever you commit a crime, you untap it. This ability triggers only once each turn. A 2-mana 1/1 that can tap for mana of any color is usually a C or C+ these days. So how good is the crime upside? Well, it isn't entirely irrelevant. You can use plot or creatures that target for free when they attack to actually get 2 mana out of this in a turn. If you have to spend mana to commit the crime, obviously it's less good, but I think this looks like a nice common overall, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Intrepid Stable Master, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 human scout and uncommon. It has reach, it can tap for green, and it can tap for 2 mana of any one color, but you can spend that mana only to cast mounts or vehicles. This feels like a pretty push 2-drop. I'm already always playing a 2-mana 2/2 with reach that can tap for green, and feeling pretty good about it. So the mount upside here really pushes this into the realm of being a pretty high pick, giving it a B. Next up, it's Map the Frontier, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and or desert cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. I want this to be good, but it's been a while since a card that does nothing but search up lands has been worth it in Limited. Paying 4 and not adding to the board might just mean you're dead when your opponent is curving out. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Ornery Tumblewag, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 Brushwag mount at rare. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. When it attacks while saddled, double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature, and it has Saddle 2. This card is great. If you play it in your first main phase, you're going to get the counter right away, and it can put it on itself if you have to. We've seen creatures with this combat trigger be bombs in the past, and that's going to be true here too. You don't even need to ever saddle this for it to be awesome, but the upside of doubling counters can really matter sometimes. This will augment your board right away, very efficiently, and if it's left unchecked, things snowball until your opponent can't cope. I'm giving this an A. Next up, it's Outcaster Greenblade, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/2 human mercenary at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land card or a desert card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. It gets +1/+1 for each desert you control. This is like a nice source of fixing. The set has desert duels, so being able to grab those is a big deal, especially because it also makes this at least a 3-mana 2/3 with this nice mana fixing ability, and if you've got other deserts, it can stay relevant even longer, giving it a B. Next up, it's Outcaster Trailblazer, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/2 human druid at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you add 1 mana of any color. Whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card, and it has plot for 2 generic and a green. This is a neat design. If you plot it, the turn you play it, you actually net mana. If you don't, it's less likely you'll have a way to use that single mana you get back, but if you can, that feels pretty good too. Drawing cards off of 4+ power creatures is doable, and also gives you another reason to plot this, because if you can play it and then drop a 4 power thing in the same turn, you're sure to get a card of value back right away. This looks pretty good either way you cast it, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Patient Naturalist, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 human scout at common. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, put a land card from among the milled cards into your hand if you can't create a treasure token. I have pretty high hopes for this card. We saw one a lot like it in our last trip to Innistrad, and it didn't have the treasure upside. Now, to be fair, this format isn't overloaded with graveyard stuff, but black-green is a graveyard deck, and a 3-mana 2/3 that draws you a card or makes a treasure is perfectly fine, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Railway Brawler, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 Rhino Warrior at Mythic Rare. It's got Reach and Trample. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is its power, and it has plot for 3 generic and a green. You're going to want to plot this more often than not. That's because the best way to use this style of card is to wait until you can also play another creature in the same turn. That way you make sure you get the value out of the Brawler before your opponent can ever kill it. Plot makes that a lot easier to do, and if you pull it off, which isn't very difficult, your opponent's going to be in serious trouble, and you can always just run it out as a super efficient creature if you need to, and that's the fail case. I think this is a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Rambling Possum, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 possum mounted uncommon. When it attacks while saddled, it gets +1/+2 until end of turn. Then you may return any number of creatures that saddled it this turn to their owner's hand, and it has Saddle 1. A 3 mana 3/3 is always a nice baseline, and Saddle 1 seems super easy to achieve with all the tokens in this set, so this will attack as a 4/5 reasonably often. The bounce part of the effect probably won't come up a ton, but it does let you put the creature back in play untapped, reducing the cost of saddling in some ways. Of course, spending mana again isn't great unless you have nothing else to do. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Raucous Entertainer, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 plant barded uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that entered the battlefield this turn. This ability keeps this 2/2 relevant all game long, and it's cheap enough to actually be usable on many turns. If you put multiple bodies into play and can use it, it'll be especially good. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Reach for the Sky, which for 3 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura with flash and enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +3/+2 and has Reach. When Reach for the Sky is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Flash auras always have potential because they are like combat tricks that leave value behind on the board. Unfortunately, at 4 mana, I feel like this is just too costly to be something you want to use all the time. I do like that it replaces itself most of the time, but it just seems so inefficient and is especially dangerous to try to use anytime your opponent has mana up. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Rise of the Varmints, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. Create X 2/1 green varmint creature tokens, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard, and it is plot for 2 generic and a green. This has a ton of potential as a graveyard build-around. If you consistently get 3 tokens with it, you'll feel fine about it, and it has the potential to be a straight-up win condition, something we've seen with similar cards in the past like Spider Spawning and Rise from the Tides. Because of that, this likely needs a build-around grade. You need a critical mass of creatures, and you need graveyard synergy, or this just won't do the job often enough. It's probably an F in your typical green deck in the format, and a C+ in a color pair like black-green. Next up, it's Smuggler's Surprise, which for 1 green mana is a rare instant, and it has Spree. You can pay 2 generic to mill 4, and you put up to 2 creature and or land cards from among the milled cards into your hand. You can pay 4 generic and a green to put 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield, and you can pay 1 generic to have creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This looks pretty nice. The base effect is basically the 3 mana draw 2 that loads your graveyard. So also having this work nicely as a way to protect a big creature or creatures is quite good. The bummer is that the most expensive mode on the card generally isn't very good. Sure, if you combine it with the first option, you're more likely to have something to put into play, but effects that let you cheat a creature into play from your hand just never play well in Limited. You just don't have something appropriate to put in play very often. Still, this card delivers a lot of value with the other 2 modes, and the most expensive mode, while the least useful in Limited, is upside on a card that's already pretty good. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Snakeskin Veil, which for 1 green mana is a common instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains hexproof until end of turn. This is a great trick when we can see it. It can blank removal for 1 mana, and the stats boost can allow the creature to win combat reasonably often. Being able to do both of those for only 1 mana is awesome. Giving this a C+. Next up, it's Spinewoods Armadillo, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 7/7 armadillo at uncommon. It's got reach and ward 3, and you can pay 1 generic and a green and discard it to search your library for a basic land or desert, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle, and you gain 3 life. I always love this kind of creature. It's big and imposing in the late game, and in the early game it fixes your mana really effectively, especially if you've got some desert duels. It even gains you life when you use it to grab a land. It isn't too shabby as a reanimation target for the black-green deck either, and once it's in play, however it got there, ward helps make it very challenging for your opponent to deal with efficiently, and if they can't, they're staring down a huge creature. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Spinewoods Paladin, which for 4 generic and a green is a 5/4 human knight at common with trample. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life, and it has plot for 3 generic and a green. This style of creature is always nice for helping you stabilize against aggro, as the big body and the life can often just swing the game right around in your favor. It's also a nice attacker when the time comes for that, and plot can let you bring it down early sometimes, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Stubborn Burrow Fiend, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Badger Beast mounted uncommon. When it becomes saddled for the first time each turn, mill 2 cards, then Stubborn Burrow Fiend gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard, and it has Saddle 2. This has the potential to be absolutely massive when you saddle it, but the fact that you need cards in the yard and a creature to saddle it does mean you have to fulfill 2 requirements to make that happen, and they even have to be creature cards in the graveyard. Neither is a massive hurdle, but neither is automatic either. Still, it has a decent baseline, and that trigger can help keep it relevant all game long, giving it a C+. Next, it's Throw from the Saddle, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on it instead if it's a mount. Then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. This is great. I mean, Rapid Bite always performs well, and this is strictly better. Even with 0 mounts in your deck, this is awesome, as the +1/+1 counter means your creature will be able to take down bigger things and probably even attack more effectively on the same turn. Obviously, getting the counter is even better, but you really don't need it to do that to pull its weight. As usual, there is an obligatory warning to pay attention to how much mana your opponent has, otherwise you might get blown out, but this is cheap enough that you'll find a nice spot for it, and it's premium removal, giving it a B. Next up, it's Trash the Town, which for 1 green is an uncommon instant with Spree. You can pay 2 generic to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. You can pay 1 generic to give a creature trample until end of turn. And you can pay 1 generic, and until end of turn, target creature gains. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw 2 cards. Just getting one of these modes is pretty weak. They can be situationally strong, but the real upside here is getting multiple modes late, at which point you're doing some serious work. If you can run over an opposing creature and draw 2 while you do it, that will feel particularly insane, and that's not like a massive stretch. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Tumbleweed Rising, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. Create an XX green elemental creature token where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, and it is plot for 2 generic and a green. It's annoying that this is effectively a blank card if you don't have anything on the board. That means it won't feel like it's worth playing on turn 2 that often, and obviously that hurts the viability of a 2-mana card. Still, the fact it has plot means you can stash it away to cast it later when your board does have some big creatures around, at which point the 3 mana you spent several turns ago will feel okay, but that also means you're spending 3 mana to not add to the board, so you're probably only doing that if you have nothing else to do. I'm giving this a C. And our last green card is Voracious Varmint, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Varmint at common with Vigilance. You can pay 1 generic and sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. We have one of these little utility creatures in virtually every set these days, and they're always fine. A 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance is right around a C-, and this being able to take down an enchantment or artifact here or there is enough to push it to a C. So those are all the green cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and we've now covered every card in the main set. In the next video, I'll be covering all the cards that aren't in the main set. In particular, we'll be looking at the breaking news cards, the big score cards, and the special guests. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.